Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and Sharpay's Fabulous Adventure is a really odd, really conflicted, but also really interesting little spin-off movie, one that revolves around the character many would argue to be the brightest star of the High School Musical trilogy, although I would contest that just on a writing level. But within this movie, without the interference of the rest of the East High Wildcats, there was a chance to sort of remedy the biggest issues with Sharpay, without Gabriella as a clear stopgap between her and the stage, who she name drops here because she is exactly that petty. There was space to explore Sharpay, who she really is, minus the sociopathic tendencies. There was a chance to showcase the greatness of Sharpay Evans that was always there, because you don't lead as many productions as she did without talent, vision, and grit. And the purpose of this movie is to prove to her father, and to herself, that despite her high school stumblings, she still has all of that. That her successes before Troy and Gabby stumbled on stage weren't gimmicky or incidental, but real. So then, why doesn't this movie really do any of that? Or rather, why does this movie frame itself like it is doing that, and then seemingly contradict what it wants to say about the central character here? But before we discuss how Sharpay's Fabulous Adventure works story-wise, I'd like to set the table a bit by briefly reviewing how this character ended up here. So, High School Musical originally aired way back in 2006, with Ashley Tisdale being the only notable acting talent attached to it at the time. She came into the role of Sharpay practically born to play the blonde icy diva who demands all things fabulous, but after feeling threatened by the aforementioned pair of newcomers to the stage, since they don't fit into the East High creed of sticking to the stuff you know, she creates a contrived scenario where they might miss the callbacks. And then we get our big musical finish and Sharpay pretends to end things gracefully, until a year later. Unlike the Cheetah Girls well before then, or Descendants well after, High School Musical's earth-shattering overnight popularity resulted in the quickest turnaround for a DCOM sequel ever, with the second installment coming only a year later, and the third, a full feature film, only a year after that. Needless to say, Disney Channel wasted little time capitalizing on the biggest DCOM franchise of all time. But that invites a few notable problems. High School Musical 2, from Sharpay's perspective, is written as if the first movie's resolution never happened, which in and of itself isn't a problem if you simply don't buy into how quickly she changed. But because of that, the sequel doubles down on her manipulation, to the point where neither Ryan nor any of the employees she has unadulterated control over is safe. And all this to essentially trap Troy into falling in love with her. So, of course, years after the fact, the internet comes up with a bunch of half-baked theories as to why she was the protagonist the whole time. No. So then she learns her lesson again, and High School Musical 3 happens, which feels more like the version of Sharpay they were going for immediately after the first movie, because here, she's marginally more accepting of her understudy role while still trying to find a way to bob back to the top. And even though her plans to get rid of Gabby here are still heinous, she kind of has more of a point. Because removed from that context, Gabriella should be taking her future a bit more seriously, and eventually does end up at Stanford in spite of her initial hesitations, because it's the smart choice. And I like that for all her talk of not wanting to feel trapped by always doing the right thing, she still does because she knows she'd regret it later. But getting back on topic here, Sharpay now has her own understudy in Tiara, who she treats in the exact way you'd expect. Except, now Sharpay is the one getting manipulated, which she absolutely deserves. And her triumphant, I guess, recovery from all of that only proves that she was always more self-obsessed than anything else, to the point where she could have compromised Ryan's stage vision, again, for her own sake. So, now that we understand Sharpay's history, let's take a look at her adventure. The crux of this movie, beyond Sharpay needing to prove herself, is that her dog earns an audition she assumed was meant for her. So you're probably thinking, okay, that's hilarious. So this movie is going to focus on how she finally abandons her selfish attitude, but for real, for the sake of one of the few characters she doesn't have any beef with. And then she can still work on her dreams while earning a decent enough living as his owner. Except that's not exactly what happens. Because while we are meant to believe that her dog's feelings are eventually understood, it only comes after an entire second act of being the same Sharpay that hasn't learned anything from 3 previous movies, except now it's Bradley Stephen Perry and his dog who she's scheming against. So even if the film did end with this little pupper basking in the spotlight while proud Mama Sharpay watches from the sidelines, it would come off the back of Sharpay cheating her way into glory, like she's an aspiring beauty pageant mom. But okay, there's still a main antagonist here in Amberly Adams that proves to be so much worse, to the point where she blatantly threatens the dogs competing for the role in the play. But here's the thing. Amber is using Sharpay in basically the same way Sharpay used Tiara just a movie ago, and Sharpay only agreed to become Amber's new assistant because she knew it might give her dog an advantage. So I don't think it's unreasonable to not feel at all bad that Amber's obvious heel turn places Sharpay in the exact same situation as High School Musical 3 did, to the point where she also gets one over on Amber before the movie concludes. And there was a clear option there too, because in spite of that, Sharpay as Amber's put upon secretary forced her to use a bit of that tenacity towards manual labor. So now you might be thinking, okay, the silver lining here is that she's capable of holding down a real job, even if that might mean working for her father, which would have happened had she come home a failure. But now she'd be coming into the family business with a real sense of empathy. Those employees from High School Musical 2 she couldn't care less about, now she understands. That would have made for a pretty fantastic ending to her New York experience, and it's not like she'd be any less rich. But hold on to that remark, because we'll come back to it a little bit later. So now I feel like we're starting to understand my problems here. The film positions Sharpay as the protagonist, and it does well early on to highlight her genuine passion for performance. That's something that didn't always come through before now, because she was obviously the antagonist. But that doesn't really work when nearly everything Amber's been doing are all the same things Sharpay has done, and more notably, is still doing. There was a chance to make that work too. Leaning more honestly into the idea of showbiz being a cutthroat world would have been pretty neat, but Sharpay's fabulous adventure frames her big triumph as being just as incidentally earned and worth appreciating as Troy and Gabriella's, when it's not. Which naturally leads to the fact that in spite of the story being built around Sharpay humbling herself to maybe succeed down the line, the movie pretty much abandons those goals in favor of her new boy toy saving the day by, I'm not kidding, a lab top performance. It's pretty hilarious. So the only real difference between the Sharpay of East High and the Sharpay we see here is, well, her schemes actually work out for once. But that begs the question, why is that? We understand how the plot works in favor of her, but Sharpay's adventure has a very important system backing it that turns this movie into a far more interesting one than it appears. Returning to the idea of Sharpay being extremely wealthy presents both the most incidentally thoughtful and broken element of the film to us. Her father's lack of trust in her stems from the fact that she's never really had to fend for herself, because she's always had Evan's money as a safety net. It's the classic irony of his generation, where the children are given the world because their parents want to give them what they didn't have. But, as a result, they believe those same kids don't understand the harsh realities of that same world, because they never taught them. And in this movie, he still doesn't teach his daughter, but he mistakenly believes he does. Because Sharpay isn't making it on her own, not even close. Sharpay, while personally driven, fairly tough, and certainly capable of handling it, is never given a real look at reality. Because in what reality can you stumble across a casting agent with an immediate opportunity without ever struggling through actual Broadway rejection? In what reality can you turn that misunderstanding into a golden opportunity anyways? In what reality can you casually turn down a suite this nice because no dogs allowed, only to immediately find shelter elsewhere? Well, in the reality of connections. Because her mother's friend's son, who likely also comes from money, can work out a deal to have her live in his building. Her friends, her family, the story structure and framing of the movie itself do one thing with unflinching consistency. They all bail Sharpay out, and in doing so, create this accidentally interesting look at a girl who never internalizes a lesson, because she never once needs to. If that was even close to their intentions here, then we've probably got ourselves one of the most socially mindful DCOMs ever. But we know better than that. Because when it's all said and done, Kelsey earned her place in Juilliard by doing everything the right way, and it could be argued that Ryan's command of stage management was a bigger factor in also getting that scholarship than his family wealth, which he is far less consumed and defined by. But then we have Sharpay, who wriggles her way into a Broadway production by learning literally nothing and taking full advantage of her, well, advantages. I'm just not sure the writers thought about how incompatible these resolutions are within the same franchise due to the intentions being pretty much the same in all cases, which, all in all, makes Sharpay's adventure a fascinating one, but in my opinion, not quite a fabulous one. I think it's fairly well acted. It has some neat, classic DCOM writing flourishes that usually give these films their charm. Ryan being in it at all, even for just an end credit scene, is worth the world. And it makes pretty good use of the most underrated High School Musical 2 song to aid the score and tone. But below the surface is a really confused film and an even more confused spin-off, one that actively writes against itself on multiple occasions, and all in favor of a mostly songless and somehow more thematically dubious take on the most basic elements of this franchise. But I can honestly say that what it almost stumbled into made it far more entertaining to me than more straight-laced bore-fest like either Twitch's movie. To conclude, I can't say for sure if I'll ever do another DCOM review, but I'm glad I got to return to my YouTube roots for my 50k subs milestone and take a closer look at least one more time. So for those of you just joining me, for those of you who found me through my Ranger vids, and for those of you who have somehow stuck around long enough to understand my frustrations with Twitches, thank you, all of you. And really, what's more fitting a celebration than me raking Twitches over the coals once again? Wouldn't be a proper DCOM breakdown without it. And as always, thanks for watching.